Welcome to your second meeting in Introduction to Art History. On Tuesday, you were introduced to the logistics of the course, how to navigate Canvas, what your assignments look like, what's required of you during the semester, how to set up your Friday sections. If you have any more questions about those logistics, please email me or your TAs. Today I'm going to give you a brief introduction to art history, the discipline that you're diving into in this introductory class. And the key questions I want to address today are: how do we define art? Why do we study art history? How do we study art history? How do we talk about art in formal terms, in other words, that is based on visual evidence? And what does it mean to talk about an artwork's context? What factors should we consider? I'm also going to preview a couple of objects for the semester, using them as examples of how we approach the discipline of art history, and outline for you the three thematic sections of this class. So the objects you will see on the screen today will be important, but you'll also see them again. And just a small note that for the lectures I will present to you, Dr. Duncan-O'Neill, I will give you the artist, title, and date for every object you'll see on the screen. For the guest lectures in this class, we're going to do our best, but it's good for you to take abbreviated notes of object information as you take notes on the lectures. So the question emerges, how do we define art? Outside of the academic world, art and history seem to define two very discrete and dissimilar concepts. History, as you know, is the record and interpretation of past human actions, particularly social and political actions. Art, on the other hand, refers to tangible, touchable objects, things made out of paper and marble and oil. Art is something present, something vivid, not vanished human events that make up history. But visible, tangible artwork is a kind of persisting event, a piece of history. Art continues to exist in the presence, long surviving the time after its creation. And we're going to be looking at some artworks in this class that are thousands of years old. Art is the record of the pressures, the aspirations, the spiritual imagination of one artist or a group of artists, or a patron, the person who commissions an artwork, from a particular time. De Aleva defines art as any material or visual thing that is made by a person or persons and that is invested with social, political, and/or aesthetic value by the creator, user, or patron. The last part of that definition, objects that are invested with social, political, and/or aesthetic value, that's the important part, and that distinguishes art objects from industrial objects, from functions of design. And here I'm showing you an artwork from 1696. This is a drawing of a massive monumental sculpture from France, from 17th century France. I'm a European art historian, so this is the example I'm going to give you, and you'll see this sculpture again in this class. This is a sculpture designed by Francois Girardon, and this is an equestrian statue of Louis XIV, one of the kings of France from the 17th century. Now, King Louis XIV, a king that you'll come to know quite well in this class, agreed to be portrayed in this equestrian statue a few years before the sculpture was made, in 1692, a time when France was at war against the so-called League of Augsburg, an alliance of European nations, quite a scary alliance. So he commissioned a sculpture that placed a portrait of himself, the king, on a massive pedestal, which you don't see in this drawing, in a major public square in Paris. So this artwork was intended to be outdoors, and therefore we can assume was intended to have an important public message. Now, you may not be an expert yet on 17th century French fashion, but you can probably tell that what we're seeing is Louis XIV not in his contemporary clothes, but instead wearing the costume of a Roman emperor, in addition to his voluminous curly wig, which did show him as a 17th century gentleman. So the king in this combination outfit sits astride his horse with neither saddle nor stirrups. Now, Girardon drew his inspiration from the ancient statues of former rulers, especially of Marcus Aurelius in the Capitol in Rome, a statue that I'll show you later. This is a major reference, so a general viewer would have understood this connection between Louis XIV and Marcus Aurelius. But Girardon made his own sculpture much larger, so about 21 feet high as opposed to 12. So he wanted to outdo the Roman emperor. So this sculpture is intended to demonstrate Louis's military might at a time of war, putting him in line with powerful leaders from the past and from Western civilization. The king wears the cloak of a Roman commander, but no royal emblem. In fact, only the saddlecloth is edged with the fleur-de-lis, the symbol of France. And with a straight back, a gaze directed far ahead, and a sort of disdainful expression, the king points with his index finger, in an imperial gesture. So this is a sober, a calm, a monumental sculpture, and depicting the king in this imposing way, showing him with a kind of classical majesty worthy of antiquity. So here we see art commissioned into the service of power, a record of the ambitions of this ruler. Now, we can be and should be skeptical of the image as a record of an actual event or an actual likeness, right? Patrons of art often wanted to edit history through art, but instead it's helpful to know art helps us to understand the priorities and organization and aspirations of a society. So also, because art is tangible, part of art history's work is to understand the path the actual physical object takes through history. Now, this original sculpture, the reason we're looking at a drawing here, is that the original sculpture was melted down during the French Revolution in the 1790s, so 100 years after it was constructed, and it was turned into bullets as the population turned against the monarchy. A much smaller scale version of Girardon's design lives at the Louvre Museum in Paris today. But art history, as the study of objects made by human hands, that record of the travels and political path and material history of these objects is part of the story and becomes quite important, especially as objects emerge from deeper and deeper in time. So art history is the study of objects made by human hands and invested with value, but this is quite a broad definition, and there are often exceptions. Now, we're familiar with classifying art as including architecture and sculpture, the pictorial arts, and by pictorial arts I mean painting and drawing and printmaking and photography, basically anything flat or two-dimensional. Art can also encompass craft arts and design, producing objects of utility, so that includes furniture and ceramic wares and textiles. Again, these have to be sort of invested with a kind of extra value. Now, traditionally, and this is where the artworks on your screen come in, Machines and machine-produced objects fall outside of the scope of art history and into the history of technology, for instance. However, there are challenges to this, especially as technology progresses, and it's not a strict distinction. Even in the 19th century, you can see on your left, William Morris's Ivanhoe pattern counts as art. It's what we're seeing is a mass-produced fabric or wallpaper design, but designed by an artist whose goals of making sort of mass-produced, industrially available art had a political, a kind of socialist bent. On the right, you're seeing a sculpture by Richard Serra. This is one of his many steel sculptures. This is 3 cuts. And Richard Serra's pieces tend to be fabricated not by his own hand. He conceptualizes his sculptures, but often doesn't touch them. This piece was fabricated in Germany and installed by a Long Island company. So art can move further away from the sort of homemade and technical prowess. So ideas and aesthetic sophistication, as well as cultural importance, lead us to categorize both of these objects as art, but not all industrially made steel beams are art, and not all wallpaper is art. And that's where it gets a little bit tricky. So speaking broadly in art history, in order to assign meaning to artworks, we look at 3 primary categories: form, iconography, and context, to approach the meaning of a work of art. So for instance, let's talk about the context in which this sculpture was supposed to be or originally situated, right? It was created in 17th century France, so the time period, the place, and it was created under the political regime of an absolute monarchy. So this was made for a king, and a particularly powerful ruler, and a period in which wealth and elegance were valued. Context also means where it was meant to be shown or housed, so that public square in Paris. So using context, we can make some arguments or assumptions. This was commissioned by a king for a public message, right? Not all artwork commissioned for kings was meant to be public. Some was very private. Some art was made for very private spiritual devotion or expression of ideas. But this context, this public square, the size of this work, gives us a sense that there's a broader political message at work, right? So that's context sketched out a little bit. Iconography is a tricky term. It might be a new term. This means the sort of symbolic language in art. Now, the symbols in this sculpture tell us that we're looking at a man, and a specific kind of man, a 17th century French aristocrat. And that iconography comes from the wig. This was something that you needed to be wealthy to be able to afford this kind of wig, and it was important enough to Louis XIV and his status as an aristocrat, a gentleman, a landed member of the landed class, that he included it even as his costume is that of a Roman emperor. So that piece of iconography sometimes is language that needs deciphering by experts. So sometimes you can read that and make assumptions. You can make assumptions based that this is a Roman costume based on the cape and the sort of gladiator skirt and the gladiator sandals that you see Louis wearing here, but you might not know every piece of the language, so that requires some reading and some history. Iconography also leads us to relate this sculpture to the sculpture of Marcus Aurelius. We know that this association between the symbolic language of these two sculptures helps us to understand that Girardon is posing Louis XIV as a military leader, right, in the line of other successful military leaders. Iconography also helps us to understand that it's difficult, and you might know this, to ride a horse without a saddle, right? It's also difficult to balance a statue, a massive statue of a horse walking, right? You can see one foot is lifted off the ground as the horse is in motion. And so this communicates a sense of meaning. Girardon is showing you that Louis is quite an accomplished rider, right? He rides this horse in a skilled way and also shows off a bit about his own skill as a sculptor. So context, iconography, and the last category, and one of the most important to art historians, is form. And form is how artworks are constructed, the formal composition, in other words. So this relates to things like size and material, which are important for understanding this artwork, but also more subtle visual categories. And this gets us into the realm of visual analysis. Visual analysis is the basic unit of art historical writing. Sources as varied as art magazines and scholarly books and undergraduate research papers rely on concise and detailed visual analyses. The purpose of a visual analysis is to recognize and understand the visual or formal choices artists make in creating their artworks. By observing and writing about separate parts of art objects, you will come to a better understanding of the art object of a whole. So a visual analysis addresses an artwork's formal elements, visual attributes such as color and line and texture and size. A visual analysis as a paper may also include historical context or interpretations of meaning. But essentially, if you're asked to write a visual analysis, you're using visual or formal qualities as evidence in your argument. So to write a visual analysis, you have to look closely at an art object and translate your visual observations into written text. It doesn't simply record your observations, though. Art historians use the strategy to make a claim about the meaning of a work of art. So the process of visual analysis, you want to observe an artwork and write down your observations with precision. We need to consider the composition and colors and textures, the size, the space, and other visual and material attributes of the artworks. So going beyond first impressions, this can take some time, right, for your eye to absorb, for you to understand the visual logic of an artwork. Then we formulate a main claim, considering how formal elements impact the meaning of an artwork. So for instance, you can say Girardon shows Louis XIV holding his power and skill with ease through a relaxed pose, relaxed serpentine lines, and technical feats with subtlety in order to communicate a message about power comfortably held, military power especially. So we can also relate this work to other works you have studied visually, considering how it is similar to and different from other objects. So we can look at other equestrian statues, like that one by Marcus Aurelius, which you'll see later, and discuss how the different and subtle visual choices compare and contrast to make meaning. So when you are creating a visual analysis, you're going to support your main claim, a main argument, with visual details. This is, you're going to use, again, line, color, shape, texture, and material are good places to start. So if the thesis is that the sculpture is intended to reinforce the king's military power, and thus the nation's military power, linking him to the might of Roman emperors, I would discuss the size of the statue, the material, which we haven't even discussed yet, which is bronze, the sort of easy, relaxed serpentine lines of the arms of Louis XIV on this horse, the texture, which is quite smooth and polished, again, communicating a kind of realism, but also connecting the artistic strategies to the sculptures of antiquity here. So you might be asked in discussions in this class and in your papers to offer one or more interpretations of possible meanings of works of art. But essentially, art history's job is to marshal context and iconography and form in order to make arguments about the meaning of artworks. In terms of materials, this class will look primarily at sculpture and painting and architecture, the sort of traditional categories of art. These have long been the media and materials that art history has been most concerned with. There are also, of course, other kinds of art. The performing arts, music and drama and dance have their own separate histories by virtue of being temporal or time-based rather than spatial and static. And if you're interested in those, there's also great classes at OU on the history of music, the history of drama, the history of dance. And of course, the performing arts are always in dialogue with the visual arts. Photography is also a category that was only recently considered to be an art. So there weren't art history professors specializing in photography until the 1980s. And digital photography, of course, which moves even farther from craftsmanship and the human hand, sort of pushes the categories of art history even more. And we're going to look at photography as an art in March in this class, and photography's role in defining race in America. Video and digital media are even more recent, and these are also considered by art historians as well. What is and is not considered art is also necessarily exclusionary and often has interesting and problematic histories. One critique of the major textbook of my parents' generation, for instance, so this is maybe 40 years ago, this textbook is called Jansen's. You might have one sitting around your own parents' homes. There's this huge textbook, Jansen's textbook of art history, and there's no women artists in the entire book. Now, it's impossible to think, right, that women weren't making things by hand that had value for most of human history, right? Do we think that women or people of color or queer folks weren't concerned with individual expression or spiritual devotion or aesthetics, again, throughout human history? Very unlikely, right? Many objects that were historically made by these groups were not considered to be high art. Instead, they were considered to be craft or anthropological objects. So things like ceramics and embroidery and quilts, which you see on your left, and textiles, even watercolors, things that were traditionally done by women or people of color, were not considered to be fine art, and that is an exclusionary decision, right? This is part of problematic institutional histories. Also, and I'm referring now to the object on your right, until a few decades ago, art from non-Western societies. And here you're seeing an incredible object, an ikisi, from the Democratic Republic of Congo from the 19th century. Art from non-Western societies like this was typically put under the discipline of anthropology and put into anthropological museums. Now, our world has always been globally connected. And humanity, arguably, has always been visually expressive, right? They just found the new oldest cave painting, I think from 40,000 years ago, I think. And so cultures in the early modern world were connected, and these cultures adopted practices shaped by social and religious beliefs and political power. We see North African architectural influence in Spain, in Venice, which is, a major player in any Italian Renaissance art history class, was the center of intense trade and global influence. African masks inspired the cubism of Picasso and Braque. And so we're going to sort of try to correct some of these assumptions about artworks made by non-Western artists and try to draw some of these global connections through this thematic organization of this Introduction to Art History course. So why do we study art history? We see it as a way to understand that people have different perspectives, that they've had different priorities and values, ways of seeing and understanding the world. I want you, for instance, to imagine being a viewer of this monumental palace entryway in ancient Assyria. We're going to talk about this on Tuesday. By imagining this, you're transported in a way to a time much different than our own, nearly 3,000 years ago. The sense of awe that we're meant to feel helps us understand the experience and values of people who lived at a very different time than our own. And art in general, for a lot of human history, is meant to communicate quite clearly. Now, of course, some artworks required specific knowledge of texts and religious doctrines, and that certainly helps enrich our understanding of artworks. But art also tended to serve a didactic purpose. A lot of viewers of art in human history were illiterate. That's just the history of literacy throughout the world. So they're meant to speak broadly. They're meant to communicate clearly. And it's essential that we understand what we're understanding, right? What we are processing as we behold and observe artworks throughout the world. Art history helps us uncloak hidden ideologies in what we see and might not notice carefully. For instance, on the left, this is just an advertisement outside a Paris department store. Art history helps us understand the way parenthood is framed, right, in contemporary advertisements. This is an advertisement talking about the new man. So how is parenthood, motherhood, fatherhood, capitalism, work, generational change framed in this advertisement? Art history helps us understand this. It also helps us understand the messages our nation's Capitol building sends us through its citation of ancient Roman temples and French palaces. We're less susceptible to these ideologies sneaking into our brains and influencing us if we can name them, right? We become more sophisticated consumers of visual material. And in my mind, this could not be more relevant because we're so inundated with visual material. Messages, both overt and covert, are presented to us in the news, in the framing of presidential portraits, in memes, or the ephemeral images we encounter just scrolling through our phones. So it's important for us to understand the strategies, the iconography, the context, the form of what we're looking at. Art history is also an interdisciplinary field. Through the context of artworks we study, also the fields of history and anthropology, sociology, war and politics, biographies. We study literature and theology and critical interpretation. We also, and this might not be as obvious, we're actually not going to look at this artwork specifically in this class. This is Masaccio's Trinity with Virgin. This is an important artwork in the Italian Renaissance. But art is also used to understand optics, for instance, how vanishing point perspective works, how our eyes interpret space in 2 dimensions, in other words. Art helps us understand chemistry, how paint was prepared. Art has intersections with neuroscience, what happens with the brain when it encounters color or representations of space, visual material. And for a lot of human history, art and geometry were studied by the same people. Geometry was used in composing artworks and in 2 dimensions and in architectural forms. And of course, right, art intersects with physics and engineering. How on earth did 15th century architects get massive church domes to stay up? Or domes in the ancient world? We'll be looking at the Roman Pantheon in this class in our discussion of the U.S. Capitol building. So art was often the expression of the very latest, the most cutting-edge thinking in scientific fields, right? How else would you honor a pope in Renaissance Italy than to use the latest developments in physics and mathematics to build the largest churches in the Western world? This class is divided into 3 thematic sections. The first is art as spiritual expression. So art's desire to render divinity, to give divinity a form, to give religious or spiritual feelings and belief a form, a tangible form. And at left is a devotional image in the Christian tradition in Northern Europe. This is the Ghent altarpiece, a very famous altarpiece. It's movable, it opens and closes, and we're looking at the inside here, where God is represented as a king. And there's a theme about God's redemption and forgiveness, his sort of mighty saving power. This was a domestic religious object made for the private chapel of a wealthy patron. And here we see an example of how art helps shapes spiritual expression. So not only giving form to, but shaping the experience of the Christian tradition for its owner. And the physicality of painting, and you'll get to see incredible details from this altarpiece when we discuss it. The physicality of this painting reflects the belief in the tangible presence of God on earth. So this section will help us illuminate historical circumstances around belief. At right is a very different artwork. This is a contemporary artist, a living artist named Jamie Bates Sloan. She's actually an art professor here at OU. And this sculpture, in part, is a meditation on motherhood. It illuminates the difficulties of motherhood in the artist's time, a 21st century woman contemplating the difficulties of embarking on that journey, balancing career aspirations, fears about the fragility of one's own body. So On the left, we have an explicitly Christian image from the Northern Renaissance. And at right, we have the work of a contemporary sculptor, a secular work, right? A work that's not associated with any religion. But both are thinking about big existential questions about life and death and the body and fate. And so in this section, we'll think about how art is expressing some of those big existential desires and motivation. We'll look at religious objects from the current Democratic Republic of Congo. We will look at Vincent van Gogh and the Northern European sense of spirituality in the secular age. We'll look at Islamic art, and we'll look at Roman art and the art of ancient Mesopotamia. So we'll be discussing religion, but we'll also strive to understand how the formal qualities of an artwork impact meaning. Why, for instance, are Vincent van Gogh's brushstrokes painted like flames licking upward, separating into vibrant contrast? How does medium change the meaning of artworks, whether that's an oil painting, a mass-produced work on paper, a sculpture in the round, or the monumental space of a cathedral or palace? And this class will help you break down and describe the qualities of an artwork and make arguments about meaning. In the second of the 3 units of this class, we will explore representations of the self and other. Many of these artworks will fall under the genre of portraiture, although not all. And here you see 2 portraits in 2 very different media from 2 very different moments, but both are attempting to do very similar things. And again, before we begin, we need to ask ourselves, why study art history? And again, I'll say that we live in a moment where images have circulated as never before, and we need to be savvy consumers of our image-saturated culture. So on the left, you see a portrait that I pulled from Instagram, a satire account, Rich Kids of Instagram. Presumably, this was commissioned or at least choreographed by the sitter to achieve some goal. And what is this image telling us? Well, it's celebrating, right, luxury through the coat, the hat, the display of Chanel here. We'll get into the details when we discuss elegance in French portraiture here. But the sitter, through that sort of casual pose with a cigarette, which in the 21st century sort of flaunts convention, right? He's demonstrating a kind of ease, right, with both his wealth and position in the world. So this maintains a kind of message of propaganda, specific strategies of staging the self. And we can learn about portraits like this from historical examples that use some of the same visual rhetoric. On the right is our friend Louis XIV again, the same king that we saw the equestrian statue of. Here is a painting, one of my favorite artworks of all time. This is a painting by Hyacinthe Rigaud, and this is a portrait of Louis XIV from 1701, so a couple of years after that equestrian statue. And like our rich kid of Instagram, he's wearing his power quite casually, demonstrating his worth through the materials activated in this painting. But the painting at right, this is an oil painting of great size. This was more than a vanity project. In the 18th century, the king's body was seen as being one and the same as the nation of France. So his physical appearance was thought to literally embody broader national values, be they elegance or excess or selfish appetites. Here it's elegance. So representation, this portrait, this representation of the king's body has these broader national and political messages. Art can also be used to memorialize bodies through both abstraction and figuration. We see memorials especially struggling to give a form to trauma, to loss, those ineffable experiences that can take place both on an individual level and also on an almost unthinkable mass scale. So in this class, we're going to talk about how artists give form to loss on those personal scales and mass scales. And we'll also discuss how memorials might embed a criticism of people and institutions of power that might have caused that loss. We'll also discuss how the race or gender of both artist and sitter might impact the meaning of an artistic representation. For instance, does art always humanize its sitter? Does it always elevate its maker? What are the power dynamics involved in making an image of someone or of looking at an image of someone? When were underrepresented groups acknowledged as participating in artistic practice, and are those doors still open? And how does making an image of something as contested as identity define what whiteness or blackness or being Native or Latinx, being a man, a woman, a sexual identity? How does art help define those categories? In our third section, we will take a closer look at representations of nature as well as constructions of the built environment. We'll look at landscape paintings from England and the American West and from China. You'll see 20th century railroad advertisements for California and cowboy paintings. These may not seem as exciting or controversial as the previous artworks I've previewed on their faces, but I'm hoping this class illuminates the potential radicalism and hidden ideologies in representations of land and nature. Landscapes convey very specific social, philosophical, and political convictions. At right, for instance, as the Tang dynasty in China disintegrated, the concept of withdrawal into the natural world became a major thematic focus of poets and painters, as we see in this Song Dynasty scroll. Landscape has long served to define nation around the world, a sense of national identity, whether that's communicating abundance, control, fertility, escape. There's often this subversive meaning in how land is represented. Land, after all, right, is a resource. It's also defined in contrast to civilization, so is often seen as an escape or a kind of opposite. And landscapes can be reflections of specific moments in time, right? Even as they're often presented as being, big air quotes here, timeless. For instance, in the painting at left, a painting by Frederick Edwin Church, we have an artist working on the very eve of the American Civil War. And the painting can be interpreted by analyzing its form and iconography and context as showing ambivalence about man's presence on Earth. So in this class, we will see how art reflects and shapes our experience of the world. You will see and learn how to read not only the formal qualities like scale and color and perspective, but also read ideological content in art, understanding how images are always trying to persuade us, how they are framing information. So even if this is your only art history class at the University of Oklahoma, it is my goal to think that after it's done, you will learn to think critically, that you will improve your writing, and above all, that you'll be able to look closely and read images adeptly. I'd like you all to become more sophisticated consumers of visual material in our image-saturated world. So Tuesday we will discuss politics and spirituality in ancient Mesopotamia. So make sure you read the assigned article by Augusta McMahon.